Rene Kizilcec, Chris Piech, and Emily Schneider. So which one of you are going to start first? Emily, I turn it over to you for Deconstructing Disengagement.
Hi there. This paper was written collaboratively between the three of us and in the spirit of interdisciplinarity that we've all been talking about. I'm in the learning sciences, Chris is in computer science, and Renee's in communication. And in the spirit that the paper was written, we're actually also all going to be presenting together. And you should feel free to ask questions at any point. There will also be a question period at the end, but if you want to jump in and clarify anything, please go ahead. You've all been hearing a lot about MOOCs in the last year and a half or so, and there's a few different models out there. But the MOOCs that we're talking about, we looked at in this paper, are what you could probably call it more of an instructionist and individualized model, where the courses are 6 to 10 weeks long. Students can enter at any point, but once the courses are closed, you can't get in anymore. Every week there's 2 to 3 hours of video lectures, and the videos have embedded quizzes or assignments that people are doing. There's assessments with regular deadlines, and once the deadline is passed, you can usually still do the assessment, but it doesn't count towards your grade. And then there's a discussion forum for learners to interact, and you can imagine probably a lot of ways where the interconnectivity of the web can enable more connection between learners than a discussion forum might enable, but in this particular MOOC model, which is sort of the most prevalent so far, we haven't seen a lot of that. So the big question right now is, how do we understand whether MOOCs are successful, and how do we improve them? And the challenge there comes really from the fact that they're open courses, and this isn't the open of open educational resources quite yet. We're not remixing the pieces of the MOOCs quite yet, but they're open as in open access. So we have learners from all over the world at any point in their personal or professional development coming to the courses for a wide variety of reasons. People maybe they want to do the course all the way through, but maybe there's just a particular piece of the topic that they are interested in, and they come in, watch a few videos, maybe do an assessment, maybe not. And after that, they leave, and they're satisfied. But how do we understand that when we're talking about the overall metrics? So first, you could think about looking at assessment scores, looking at people's grades. That's usually a pretty standard thing to look at when we're talking about whether people have learned or not. But in this case, not everybody is taking assessments. Again, people are coming in for their own reasons, so they're not necessarily going to choose to do assessments. So we are not going to have grades for everybody. We're not going to be able to map learning onto that. Completion rates are what a lot of people have been talking about when they're talking about MOOCs. This is problematic for a few different reasons. The first is that completion rates that people are talking about are usually whether or not the number of people who have earned a certificate at the end of the course or not. This is whether they passed the course, and this is based on assessment scores. It's based on what grade they got previously. So if they're choosing not to do assessments, they're not being counted among those completers. In completion rates also, there's a question of what your denominator should be. We hear a lot of very high numbers for the enrollments in MOOCs, tens of thousands of people in every single course. But definitely in the courses that we looked at, and I think this is pretty universally true, the reported enrollment numbers tend to be 30, 40, even 50% higher than the number of students who ever come into the course and are active in any way. So initial enrollment is more of an indication of participation, of interest rather than participation. So the denominator doesn't work. And finally, looking at completion rates is sort of a binary indicator, whether you completed the course in this particularly defined way or whether you didn't. And that basically puts in one big group everybody else who are engaging with the course in a lot of different ways. So it doesn't have a lot of nuance in terms of these different potential subpopulations of learners and how they're engaging, and doesn't provide any indication of how we can design any kind of course features or interventions around them. So that doesn't work either. So what do we turn to? process measures is a general term, but by that we mean interactions with the course content. This is data that we have for all learners who engage at any point in the MOOC in any way, and also, as I think John just mentioned in the previous panel, that there's a lot we can learn from the ways that people are interacting with course content. Learning is this process of interactions with learning objects and with the other humans in the course. And so looking at the processes that people engage in when they're interacting with these resources is potentially a good way to characterize their learning and to characterize these different patterns of engagement. So this is something that we can turn to. So how do we classify learners into meaningful subpopulations based on process measures? We think that for developing a classifier based on the data that we have coming out of MOOCs, there is some criteria that we could turn to. That a classifier should be universal, so we can apply it across multiple courses and contrast and compare. It should be based in theory, so again, talking about the processes of learning. And the features that we choose should be not just arbitrary ones that seem to create natural groupings among the learners, but those that are actually related to how we believe learning is occurring. A good classifier should be parsimonious, so based on a small, meaningful feature set. We have a vast amount of data that we can choose from, and we should be choosing those features, again, based on theory, and then ones that will give us sort of meaningful groups. And finally, the classifier should be predictive, so we can make assumptions about what's going to happen next, and ultimately dynamic. The latter two are something that we will be able to do with analytics from MOOCs in the future, but in this work was these sort of post-hoc analyses of MOOC data, so we were focusing on the first three, but they could be implemented in a way that was more predictive and dynamic in the future. And these subpopulations, you are not moving forward. There we go. So just want to bring up, so these subpopulations that we're talking about can be used also in a couple of different ways other than looking at trajectories for success. You can compare subpopulations across across other measures that are not included in the feature set. So those could be their interactions with other pieces of the course. If we're focusing on defining the subpopulations by a few interactions, there might be other habits that those learners are engaging in, which will tell us something about what it means, what put them in that subpopulation, essentially. And likewise for personal characteristics of those learners. Maybe there's a lot of people who have a certain level of experience in a topic that end up in a particular subpopulation. And finally, the subpopulations as a lens for analysis can also be used to compare across courses if there's a distribution that's different of the subpopulations that might tell us something about the way the courses are designed. So this is all in pretty general terms, but now turning to what we actually did. This keeps not working. We looked at 3 computer science courses taught by faculty at Stanford on Coursera. They're at 3 different levels of difficulty. The CS 101 is high school level, so we denote that as HS throughout the paper. Algorithms is more of an undergraduate level course, so that's UG. And probabilistic graphical models is graduate level. And in these MOOCs, so again, these are the active learners, not the overall enrollment. So we see over 20,000 in the case of the high school level course, about 46,000 enrolling. So big enrollments, predominantly male, though less so in the entry level course. Age, we're a little older than a traditional college learner, certainly, and this is. There's also a lot of folks who already have bachelor's or even master's degrees, so a lot of people who are in the professional world coming to these courses, and particularly their technical courses. So there's probably a lot of folks who are active in the software industry. And again, this is also some of the earlier courses on Coursera, so there's a lot of initial interest around people for using this sort of for lifelong learning, their professional development. And then we took a look at just the distribution across countries and see that there's a big skew towards countries that are high in the Human Development Index. So this is primarily, so the United States is the most of the learners in this course, and then we see a drastic drop down for the lower HDI countries. So there's there's this talk of the global opportunities for MOOC learners, but there's possibly like still a little ways to go here. So Chris Piech is going to talk about the use of the classifier. And voila.
Thank you very much, Emily. Okay. So do you understand the situation so far? MOOCs are confusing. We're not sure exactly how people are using it. And our goal is to find the subpopulations in MOOCs, which is where I come in as a computer scientist. So there's a lot of different ways you could find subpopulations. But what we were interested in finding subpopulations based on engagement. Whereas, like, this could be an example of a highly engaged student and a not highly engaged student. In our mind, this is how the world works. Each student, over time, has a value of engagement that's changing. And we want to find the prototypical patterns in how this engagement changes. Does that make sense? Seeing some nods. Great. The simple solution is always the first one to start with machine learning. So we start with a really simple understanding of engagement. At every single assignment period, we classified students into one of 4 engagement level groups, very coarse. We split it based on whether or not they were watching videos and whether or not they were doing assignments. We had 4 high-level categories: whether or not a student was on track, they did the assignment on time; whether or not the student was behind, they did the assignment but not on time; whether or not the student was auditing, which is they did watch videos but they didn't use the assignments; or whether or not the student was out, which they didn't interact with the material at all. This is a picture of the graduate level class and an aggregate image of all the students going through the Coursera at each of the time periods. So for example, this node over here says that there's about 5,000 students at time period 5 who were just watching videos in Coursera. Similarly, T, which stands for on track, this node shows that there's about 7,000 students at assignment period 3 who are on track in the course. Making sense? Please ask questions. And if you ask questions, I promise I will treat you with a lovely sweet. Any question, of course. Okay, so every student has a longitudinal pattern through these labels. Here's an example of one student. They show up at Coursera and they're really excited to be here. The student might have started doing assignment the first week, so he was on track, but then through the rest, he's I just want to watch videos. At some point, his mom takes him to the beach and he goes to make sandcastles. He doesn't participate, so at this point, at that week, he drops to the out category. But then he comes back and he has a wonderful experience. Every single student has their own trajectory, so that could be one student. Another example could be a person who has a full-time job and already has gone through most of their education. But maybe at some point they read a New York Times article about Coursera and want to try it. This could be their trajectory through the course material. And finally, there could be students who came in and like, yeah, I'm going to learn. But then maybe something happened and they decided that, this wasn't working out well for them. We have a lot of trajectories. For the graduate level class, we had 21,000 people who had gone through the class. Our job was to find the prototypical patterns in these trajectories. Yes? So that's a very important, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. The bubbles don't add up to 100%. Sorry? Oh, of course. It comes after the answer. So the bubbles don't add up because the out nodes are not to scale. Because the out nodes become so big, it's hard to see the patterns in the other bubbles. So in this visualization, they do not add up to 100. But by construction, they do. I'm getting better at throwing. Okay, so we cluster. We use k-means, which is a clustering algorithm. We use L1 norm. All the details are in the paper. So what happens? I've been told if I'm silent for a while, it builds suspense. Anyways, we find 4 prototypical patterns. And they seem to be very interesting. We find a pattern of students who are engaged the whole time. They're on track. A pattern of students who watch videos throughout the whole class. A pattern of students who are prototypically defined as starting on track and then disengaging. And a pattern of students who maybe just watch 1 or 2 videos throughout the entire course. Now, this is very important that you guys understand these 4 different prototypical patterns because it was one of the basis for the work we did. Are there any questions? So we have 4 patterns. We have auditors, people who mainly just watch videos and don't engage in the assignments. Completers, people who complete most of the assignments. Disengagers, people who start by completing and then either drop out or only watch videos. And samplers, people who only watch 1 or 2 videos. Is there a question? Okay, I can't quite hear you. We started with clustering. I'm going to talk about how we classify, but we were looking for a small number of groups. So we tried 4 and 5, and we really found that the powerful number was 4. All right, you're quite far back. Good luck. You get a candy. That works. Okay. So hopefully that's a bit of a teaser, but it gets a little bit more interesting. We ran the same clustering on all 3 courses that we looked at. So you can, a little more suspense. In all the classes we looked at, we find the same prototypical patterns. This seems to be a very robust, deep trend in the people who are using the Coursera classes. Even though we're running it independently on different sample of students, we're still getting the same patterns. The distributions are a little bit different. This is a picture for the undergraduate class, the 46,000 people, of how people break down between the different clusters. There's most of the students who were active. They watched at least 1 video. They did more than just click enroll. Most of those people were what we call the sampling group. They just watched 1 video. There is a large number of people who completed, a large number of people who started and then disengaged, and a few auditors. And the composition changed for the different classes. For the undergraduate classes, more samplers and more auditors. And for the master's classes, a large majority of the people who are in these Coursera classes really were samplers. In good computer science, we want to do validation. So there was a great question about how did we know 4 clusters? Well, what we did was we tried using different numbers of clusters. We tried 5, we tried 3, we tried 6. When we used more numbers of clusters, it tended to just split down the subpopulations into temporal elements. People who get disengaged early in the course, people who disengage later. Which really meant that we kept seeing the same trend over and over again. We tried different labels. You know how I told you we had on-track people who watch videos, people who are out, and people who are behind? We tried including another label, which is not only did they do the assignment, but they did well on the assignment. We got mostly the same clusters, 95% overlap. We tried removing the group of people who are behind. Again, we got the same clusters. We ran Silhouette, which is a cluster validation method, and we got that this is a really natural trend. So what I want to leave you guys with a sense is that there's this really, really powerful trend that's pervasive across the different MOOCs, at least that we looked at. Of course. That was a wonderful question. Thank you very much. Too far. So the question was, do we see trends within the disengagement? Do you see people leaving because of particular assignment? And yes, we do. One of the nice things about using clustering algorithm we did use was that it could be very specific to a class. So for some classes, most people would have a mass exodus after a certain assignment. And so we would see that as being the cluster centroid. Does that help answer your question? And yes, we do dig further, which is what I'm leaving my esteemed colleague to explain more about.
Well, digging further, tell me if we can answer this question.
Okay.
Did you think of trying to then predict individuals, which of these 4 clusters you would fall into based on the information you collected?
No, wonderful question. It's actually something we're going to do in future research. Okay. So really what I want to leave you with before I hand it off to my esteemed colleague is that we started with this idea that we wanted to find subpopulations in MOOCs. And when we ran our clustering algorithms, we found 4 very powerful clusters, 4 robust clusters that we could find repetitively in other different classes. Thank you very much. Rene Kizilcec.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'll show you a little bit about the digging deeper. We now have these wonderful 4 trajectories, which seems to be a very good way of looking at the subpopulations in these MOOCs, these CS MOOCs, I should say. So what are some of the results that we find when comparing the different clusters in the different classes, in the different courses, against each other on different features. Features that we didn't use, obviously, in the clustering before, but features that are really important. So we start off with looking at the overall experience that learners report in the post-course survey. And we find that completing learners, so those who did all the assignments, have a significantly better overall experience. Also, auditing learners, those who only watch the videos, sometimes have an equally good or not significantly different overall experience than these completing learners. What is very important to realize is that the disengaging learners, here represented by the sort of blue dot, those are like completing learners at the beginning and then suddenly drop out. But we see these very significantly different values for their overall experience in the course. What might that suggest? It suggests that we should really take care and identify these subpopulations early to be able to customize the experience that learners have. How does this identification work? Well, it might be through algorithms like the algorithm and real-time analytics that would cluster these learners early, or even self-report at the beginning. There might be different tracks that learners can sign up for, depending on what their goals are in this course. One example for customization might be that auditing learners are less, they get less reminders to do assessments because they clearly chose that assessment is not what they're there for. They're there to watch these videos, and they're happy with it, clearly, because in 2 of these courses we see that they have just as good an experience as those completing learners. Another feature that we're comparing here is activity in the discussion forum. We see that completing learners have significantly higher activity in the discussion forum as measured by posts and comments. Note the nonlinear scale on the x-axis, which is important because especially in the graduate level course we see a lot of, so the 10 means that on average learners posted 10 comments or posts. So what does this suggest? Well, first of all, it's important to note this is all observational. Jumping to causal conclusions here, somewhat like being on the forum is something that causes you to do assignments, is naive. So one important question here is, what is the causal relationship? It could be that completing learners are more likely, it causes them to be on the forum because maybe assignments is something that's more discussion worthy, or maybe the forum, seeing people talk about these assignments makes them want to do the assignments. Or it's something that's a background variable. Maybe they got something that's, maybe they're happier in some way, and that's why they do assignments, and that's why they go on the forum. What's also important is, how do systems such as reputation systems or social features that we can implement in these forums change how these different populations behave? So this is potential for experimentation to find out what the causal relationships are here. Something else we looked at is the geographical distribution. And we look at this by the Human Development Index of the countries that learners come from. We deduce these from the IP address. And we find 2 interesting patterns. First of all, we see that completing and disengaging learners are more likely to be are more likely to come from higher HDI countries, while sampling learners are more likely to come from lower HDI countries. Okay. What is important to notice here, though, is that we only have a very small population of learners who come from a low HDI country. And so what we looked into is, how about the 4 highest participating countries represented in this course, which happen to be the US, the UK, Russia, and India. And they fall into 3 out of these 4 HDI categories. The US and the UK has a very high, Russia a high, and India a medium HDI. And we see the same patterns occurring This is an example, by the way, from the graduate level course, but we see very similar patterns in the other two courses. We also looked at gender equality between, oh yeah, there's a question. Yeah.
So is it only because of human development index, or maybe there is a barrier like the language?
Mm-hmm.
Courses are in English, and maybe India, United Kingdom, and Russia is not English.
Right.
Country. So maybe it's not only about human development, but because of other factors.
Right. That's a very good point. Would you like a sweet for that? Chris built an expectation here. So that is in fact a very good point. In an analysis that is slightly different, I found that the different countries have very different. It's one of the most powerful predictors of exam score, for example. So where you're from, which is probably related to the language, but also things like the internet access that you have. Although it might be somewhat deceiving, because in India we see most people coming from the big cities where internet access is probably very good. It's not the small rural places that people are coming from. However, yes, I think language might be something very important. MOOCs have subtitles these days, but how good they are is, yeah, good question. Gender inequalities. So we're wondering, these are CS classes, after all. How does the gender picture look like? And what we're finding here, if you look at the green dots, which represent the completing learners, we find that female completing learners are underrepresented in more advanced courses. So let me tell you a little bit more about this graph here. This is the odds ratio. So an odds ratio of 6 here means that for every female learner, there were 6 male learners in the course. Okay? The dotted lines represent the course averages, and the dots with the 95% confidence intervals show you where these different groups are. And we see that for the high school level course, the top one, it's below the course average, the number of females. For the undergraduate level course, it's around the average, and for the graduate level course, it's significantly above the average. So there is some evidence for a trend that female learners are underrepresented in more advanced courses. Now, is this surprising? Well, we know from research on stereotype threat that this is actually a rather common result. So stereotype threat in this sense means that women are in more advanced courses are performing worse because of the stereotype that women are not very good at technical things, right? So what are ways to counteract that? Ways to counteract that would be to frame the assessment as something that everyone can perform in well just by working hard on the material. Not necessarily pointing out that it's gender neutral, but just that hard work on the material and everyone's going to be fine. So those are things that could be pointed out as a preamble to assessments to counteract this. Okay. Let me talk a little bit about future directions, and I think we mentioned one or two of these before, but one big one is experiments. This is an observational study, let me mention it again, and so we're very careful to not draw causal conclusions here, but we certainly generate a lot of hypotheses that can be tested in experiments in future MOOCs. And so one type of experiments might be around collaboration and peer effects. So in the forum, how do different trajectories affect each other by talking about maybe assessments? Another one is how assigning groups for projects from different trajectories might work out. Also, many opportunities for interface customization, changing presentations of videos, changing presentations of assessments, as well as targeted interventions for disengaging students. What is required for this is clearly a predictive model, which is one of the next steps in this methodology. What's also important is developing this a little bit further and being able to pick up on more nuanced analytics. One interesting divide that we're hearing more and more about is this MOOC as a course versus MOOC as a resource. Some people using MOOCs just for a few days to check out a few things that they are interested in, not really considering it as a class with a certificate, but just as a resource, like they might use Wikipedia. Also, early prediction for disengaging learners is a very important step that we should take from what we have right now. Another analysis that we did, but I didn't report on much, is the idea that you look at the reasons that learners report for enrolling in the course and compare that what they're actually doing. And we found that, in fact, completing learners are much more likely to say it before they start the course that they are coming to enhance their resume, which makes sense. So they're actually following through with their intentions. And finally, engagement trajectories seem to be a very solid methodology, at least as tested in these CS courses so far. And they need to be included in these backends for MOOCs, which currently are very spartanic, to be honest, from the ones that I've seen. And to provide real-time analytics of who's taking this course, who the audience is, including visualizations that make it easy for instructors to recognize who's there. I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank also the Stanford Lytics Lab, which is a group of students and faculty led by Roy P. and John Mitchell, the Vice Provost of Online Learning. It's a very multidisciplinary group of researchers who work on learning analytics questions. Please feel free to visit our website at lytics.stanford.edu. We would also like to thank the Office of the Vice Provost for Online Learning, Roy P., Clifford Ness, and Daphne Koller, as well as our wonderful LAK reviewers. Thank you very much.
We get one too.
Oh, we get one too.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
So we have time
for one quick question, because we were taking questions throughout. So, start over here. There,
hello. Some of you probably know who I am. Naomi Jeffrey, Open University. I'm a data person, and I'm quite excited about the idea that I can use the kind of analysis that you're doing on MOOCs as a springboard to new measures of engagement and success. Because I'm thinking beyond the pass and progression kind of standard measures of how students are succeeding on courses. Would you have any particular concerns over and above the obvious test for robustness about applying the kind of analysis you've done to courses that aren't massive or open, which I guess would make them OCs?
I think when you apply the analysis, you should do it carefully, but there's no particular reason that this should only work for massive or open access classes. You probably need at least 100 to 200 students to be able to feel very confident in the clusters that you get. But no, this should be applicable. The methodology should be much more applicable than what we used it for.
Hi, my name's Sheila McNeil. I work with CETUS in the UK. A very interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you think your 4 patterns would stand up for some of the more CMOOC type courses. I recently did the Coursera course that was run by the University of Edinburgh, which didn't have any instructor videos. So I think you've got something there, and I'm actually quite interested to see. I kind of suspect that your patterns might stand up, but I was just wondering if you had any plans to do that with some more non-traditional Coursera courses, if you like.
Sure, yeah, that is on. Okay, yeah, that is a great point too, because I think that so we would like to do that with some courses that are structured a little bit differently. In particular, at least the data that we have access to is data that courses that are out of Stanford, and so there's some courses that are on another platform entirely called NovoEd that are very group-based, and so looking at, there's a lot of group collaboration in there, so looking at whatever the appropriate features are in those courses might not be actually video lectures and assessments, but other types of things, but I think you would probably see similar types of patterns emerge, but again, like the features that you pick should be related to the structure of the course, and so you might see something slightly different, but there's probably, breaking up in that way makes a lot of sense to me. And if you want to share data about any of that, we should talk.
The Stanford folks are kindly said they'd be happy to answer further questions for anybody that has them at the close of the session. So thank you all very much. Next